There is a city on the shore of Lake Michigan, one of the great cities of the world, with its towers and its trade and its millions of people, and almost none of the people who live in it know that it exists because of a ditch. A ditch dug by hand across 96 miles of prairie and rock by Irish immigrants who were paid, when they were paid at all, in paper money that turned out to be nearly worthless, and who died by the thousand of cholera and accident and sheer misery, and were buried in unmarked ground along the line of the cut. The city is Chicago. The ditch is the Illinois and Michigan Canal, and it is one of the most important and least remembered public works in the history of the country, because what it did was connect two halves of a continent that had never been joined, the world of the Great Lakes and the world of the Mississippi, and in doing so it decided that a muddy little trading post at the bottom of Lake Michigan would become the hinge of the whole American interior. This is the story of that ditch, and of the men who dug it, who made a great city with their hands and their lives, and got, in return, worthless scrip and an early grave, and a silence that has lasted more than 150 years. The canal was built between 1836 and 1848, and to build it the state of Illinois nearly bankrupted itself, and the men who did the actual digging paid a far higher price than the state ever did. The chief engineer, a self-taught surveyor named William Gooding, laid out and directed a channel 96 miles long, 60 feet wide, 6 feet deep, climbing over the divide between the two great watersheds by a staircase of 17 locks. And through the middle of it ran the hardest and most fateful stretch of the whole project, a place where the canal had to be cut straight down through solid rock, the section they called the Deep Cut, which nearly destroyed the entire enterprise, and which was blasted and hacked out of the bedrock, foot by foot, by Irish laborers working with black powder and hand tools from sunrise to sunset. This is the story of how those men joined the Great Lakes to the Mississippi by hand, and of how the fortune they created went to a city while the bill was paid in their own bodies. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back, because the men who dug this canal are, quite literally, the forgotten foundation of Chicago, and their story is one of the hardest and most American I know. To understand why this canal mattered so enormously, you have to look at a map of the middle of the continent the way the people of the early 1800s looked at it, which is to say, as a problem of water. In that age, before the railroads, water was the only cheap way to move heavy goods any distance, and North America is divided, down its middle, by an invisible line called the Subcontinental Divide. On one side of that line, the water flows, through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, toward the Atlantic. On the other side, the water flows, through the Illinois and the Mississippi, toward the Gulf of Mexico. For all of history, those two vast water systems, which between them drained most of the interior of the continent, did not connect. A boat on the Great Lakes could not reach the Mississippi, and a boat on the Mississippi could not reach the lakes, because between them lay dry land. But at one particular spot, at the bottom of Lake Michigan, the two systems came achingly close. There, a short, low, swampy stretch of ground, only a few miles across, separated the Chicago River, which ran into the lake, from the waters that ran down to the Illinois River and the Mississippi. The native peoples and the early French explorers had known about this spot for centuries and used it as a portage, a place where you carried your canoe across the low ground from one watershed to the other. That little portage at Chicago is one of the most consequential pieces of geography in North America, and almost no one thinks about it. Picture the shape of the continent's water. From the Atlantic, you could sail up the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes, that vast inland sea of fresh water reaching deep into the heart of the continent. And from the Gulf of Mexico, you could travel up the Mississippi and its great tributaries, another enormous water system reaching up into the same heartland from the south. Between them, they touched nearly every part of the interior. But they did not touch each other, except at a handful of low places where their headwaters came close. And the lowest and best of those places was at Chicago, where only a few miles of swampy prairie, and in the wet season sometimes only a matter of feet of high ground, separated a stream running into Lake Michigan from a stream running down toward the Illinois and the Mississippi. In flood, the two sometimes very nearly joined on their own. The French explorers Louis Joliet and Father Marquette had passed through that portage as far back as the 1670s, and Joliet had seen it immediately, had written that, with only a short canal across that low ground, a boat could travel from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. He saw the whole thing 2 centuries before it was built. The dream sat there, on the map, for those 200 years, obvious and enormous and waiting, because everyone who understood the geography understood that whoever cut that little gap would unlock the entire interior of the continent to water travel, would make the low ground at the foot of Lake Michigan the place where the traffic of half a nation would have to pass. It was one of the great strategic prizes on the continent, hidden in a few miles of Illinois swamp, and people had dreamed, for a very long time, of cutting a canal across that little gap, because whoever did it would join the Atlantic world to the Gulf world, would let a boat travel by water from New York, through the lakes, across the divide, and down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and would make the low, wet ground at the bottom of Lake Michigan the single most important crossroads in the interior of North America. And I want to be honest that the impulse behind it was not modest. This was the era of what Americans called internal improvements, a fever of canal and road and railroad building, and states were competing furiously to build the works that would make them rich and important, often borrowing far beyond their means to do it. Illinois, in the middle 1830s, was young, thinly settled, and land-rich but cash-poor, and it threw itself into a wildly ambitious program of public works, of which the canal was the crown jewel. To fund it, the state was granted a huge tract of federal land along the canal route, hundreds of thousands of acres, which it could sell to raise money. And it platted new towns along the line, Lockport and Ottawa and LaSalle and the rest, and sold lots in them to raise still more, betting the whole thing on the canal's future success. It borrowed heavily from investors in the East and in Britain. It was, in every sense, a young state going all in, staking its financial future on the belief that if it could just dig this ditch, the wealth that followed would more than pay for it. That belief turned out, in the very long run, to be completely correct. The canal did create fortunes beyond counting. But between the borrowing and the payoff lay years of catastrophe, and the men who bore the worst of that catastrophe were not the officials who made the bet. They were the men who dug. It is worth knowing that this was not the first attempt to seize that prize, only the first that succeeded, because the dream had been circling for decades. Ever since Joliet, people had talked about cutting the Chicago portage, and as the young United States pushed into the region, the idea kept resurfacing. There were surveys, there were plans, there were grand pronouncements. Even the great men of the early republic had eyed it, understanding that whoever controlled that little gap controlled the commerce of the interior. But it kept not happening because it was enormously expensive and the region was, for a long time, too empty and too poor to fund it. The federal government granted the land to make it possible. The state organized itself to build it. Surveys were run and routes argued over for years before a shovel went in. So when Illinois finally broke ground in 1836, it was reaching for something that had been talked about and wanted and put off. For a very long time, a prize everyone agreed was worth having and no one had yet managed to grasp. That long buildup is part of why the state threw itself at the project so recklessly when it finally moved. This was not a casual undertaking. It was the seizing of a prize that generations had dreamed of, and the young state was determined to be the one to grasp it, whatever it cost. And it turned out to cost a great deal, most of it paid by men who had no say in the decision at all. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description, now back to it. So in 1836, the state of Illinois, young and poor and wildly ambitious, decided to dig it. And the man they eventually put in charge of the engineering was William Gooding. Gooding faced, right at the start, a decision that would shape the whole project and nearly doom it. And it came down to that stretch of high ground on the summit of the divide. There were 2 ways to build the canal across the summit. One was the deep cut, to dig the channel down deep enough, straight through the rock of the divide, that the water of Lake Michigan would flow into it by gravity and feed the canal on its own. This was the grander and more permanent solution, but it meant excavating an enormous quantity of solid rock at staggering cost. The other was the shallow cut, to dig a shallower channel and lift water up into it with pumps. This was far cheaper to build, but would cost money to run forever. Gooding and the commissioners chose the deep cut, the ambitious option, the one that meant blasting a canal down through the bedrock of the summit. It was a bold and defensible choice, and it turned out to be a financial catastrophe, because the deep cut-through rock was brutally slow and brutally expensive, and it was still swallowing money when the whole financial world came crashing down. The deep cut deserves a closer look, because it is where the ambition of the project met the hardness of the earth, and the earth won for a long time. The summit, the high ground the canal had to cross, was not soft prairie soil that a man could shovel. In the critical stretch, it was rock, and to make the deep cut work, that rock had to be removed, blasted and broken and hauled out of a deepening trench, mile after mile, entirely by hand and black powder. There were no machines for this. A crew would drill holes into the rock by hand, one man holding and turning a steel drill while another struck it with a sledge, over and over to sink a hole deep enough for a charge. They would pack the hole with black powder, set the fuse, clear the area, and fire, and then move in to clear the shattered rock and drill the next round. It was slow beyond belief, and it was deadly, because black powder in the hands of tired men working long shifts is an unforgiving thing, and premature blasts and flying rock killed and maimed workers regularly. The deeper the cut went, the harder and more expensive every foot became, and the cost estimates that had justified the whole project were blown apart as the rock refused to yield cheaply. There were people, even at the time, who argued that Gooding and the commissioners had made a terrible mistake, that they should have built the cheaper, shallow cut and used pumps and spared the state the ruinous expense of blasting through the summit. The argument raged for years. But the deep cut was what they had chosen, and once it was begun and the money was pouring into the rock, it was very hard to stop. And so the state kept digging, deeper and more expensively, straight into the teeth of the worst financial crisis the country had yet seen. The rock and the ambition together were bleeding Illinois white, and then the whole national economy fell off a cliff. Now let me bring in the men who actually did this, because a canal is not dug by engineers or commissioners. It is dug by laborers, and the laborers on the Illinois and Michigan Canal were, overwhelmingly, Irish. Many of them had come west specifically for this work, and a great number had already dug the Erie Canal in New York. So they arrived as experienced canal men, the professional diggers of the age, and they brought their skills and their strong backs to the Illinois prairie. And the conditions they worked in were merciless. They labored from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, in the heat of the prairie summer and the mud of its springs, cutting the channel with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, and where the deep cut ran through rock, drilling and blasting it out with black powder, some of the most dangerous work there was. There were no safety rules of any kind. Men were maimed and killed by premature blasts, by falling rock, by collapsing banks, by the ordinary hazards of moving enormous quantities of earth and stone by hand. A common laborer might earn something like $16 to $20 a month, and often his food and shelter, such as it was supplied by the contractor and deducted from that wage, so that a man could work a full month in that killing labor and end up owing money to the company that employed him. It was, in every sense, back-breaking work, done by tough and desperate men far from home, and it built the foundation of a great city. I do not want these men to stay abstract, so let me say a little more about who they were and how they lived. The Irish who dug the canal were part of the great tide of Irish immigration that was beginning to pour into America, men driven from a poor and troubled homeland who took the hardest and lowest paid work the new country offered because it was the work available to them. Many, as I said, were veterans of the Erie Canal and other eastern works, professional diggers who moved from project to project across the country wherever a great ditch was being cut. A mobile army of muscle that built the water highways of the young nation and was despised and exploited almost everywhere it went. On the Illinois prairie, they lived in rough camps and shanty settlements, strung along the line of the work, and clustered around the new canal towns in conditions that were crowded and filthy and unhealthy. They worked from first light to last, in the heat and the cold and the wet and the work itself, the endless shoveling and hauling, and in the deep cut, the drilling and blasting, wore men down and broke them and killed them. And they did it, for the most part, far from any family, in a strange and often hostile country, for wages that were low, even when they were paid in real money. These were not soft or fortunate men. They were among the most exploited workers in the country, doing one of its hardest jobs. And the thing they were building, though they could not have known it, would become the foundation of one of the richest cities in the world. There is a terrible dignity in that, and a terrible injustice, and both are true at once, and both deserve to be remembered. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because now I have to tell you about the disaster that nearly killed the whole thing, and that turned the diggers' hard bargain into an outright betrayal. The disaster was the Panic of 1837. Just as the canal was getting underway, the American economy collapsed into one of the worst financial crises in the country's history, a panic that wiped out banks and businesses and threw the whole nation into a long, grinding depression. To understand how completely that panic wrecked the canal, you have to understand how the whole thing was being financed, which was essentially on borrowed optimism. Illinois had no great pile of cash. It was funding the canal and its other improvements by borrowing, by selling bonds to investors in the East and in Europe on the promise of future prosperity, and by selling off its granted land. That whole structure depended on confidence, on the continued willingness of investors to lend and of buyers to buy land, on the belief that the canal would be finished and would pay. The Panic of 1837 destroyed that confidence almost overnight. Credit froze. Banks failed. Land values collapsed, so the state's land grant, which was supposed to fund the work, was suddenly worth a fraction of what had been counted on. Investors stopped lending and demanded payment on what they had already lent. And Illinois, which had borrowed far beyond its means in the boom, found itself staring at bankruptcy, unable to pay its debts, its grand program of improvements collapsing around it, with the half-dug canal sitting in the prairie as the most expensive monument to its overreach. Several states went through versions of this same disaster in those years, having gorged on debt to build canals and railroads in the boom, and then been caught by the crash, and some of them defaulted outright on their debts, a scandal that echoed all the way to the financial houses of London. Illinois teetered on the edge of that abyss for years, and every dollar the state could not raise was a dollar it could not pay the men in the deep cut, which is exactly how the crisis in the counting houses of the East reached all the way down and put worthless paper into the hands of the Irishmen blasting rock on the Illinois summit. And Illinois, which had borrowed enormous sums to build the canal and a whole slate of other ambitious public works, was caught with its finances in ruins. The state could no longer borrow, could no longer pay its debts, and could no longer fund the canal it had started. And this is where the betrayal of the workers becomes sharp and specific. As the money ran out, the men who were doing the actual digging stopped being paid in real currency. Instead, many of them were paid in canal scrip, paper certificates issued by the broke and desperate canal project, promises to pay that were supposed to be as good as money, and that turned out, as the crisis deepened, to be worth a fraction of their face value, or, in some cases, next to nothing at all. Men did months of the hardest and most dangerous labor in the state and were handed in return paper that they could not spend at full value, that merchants would only take at a steep discount, if at all. And on top of that, some were simply cheated outright by unscrupulous contractors who took the state's money, or the state's scrip, and did not pass a fair share of it on to the men. So the Irish diggers, who had come across an ocean and half a continent to do this work, found themselves risking their lives every day to build the canal and being paid for their trouble in worthless paper by a bankrupt state and cheated by the contractors on top of it. By 1842, with the money gone and the state effectively insolvent, the work was largely abandoned, the deep cut sitting half-finished in the rock, and it looked as though the whole enormous, costly, deadly enterprise might simply fail. I keep circling back to that scrip because it is such a perfect and bitter symbol of the whole arrangement. Think about what it actually meant to a man. He had crossed an ocean and half a continent. He was doing the hardest and most dangerous physical labor there was, drilling and blasting rock from before dawn until after dark, risking his life every single day. And at the end of the month, instead of coin he could spend, he was handed a piece of paper, a promise from a bankrupt state that it would, someday, somehow, be worth what it said. But the merchants and the tavern keepers and the landlords knew perfectly well that the state was broke, so they would not take that paper at face value. They would take it, if at all, at a heavy discount, giving a man perhaps half, perhaps less, of what his wage was supposed to be worth in real goods. So a man's already low pay was quietly cut in half, or worse, by the simple fact that he was paid in the promises of a failing government instead of money, and there was little he could do about it. He could not refuse the scrip and demand coin, because there was no coin. He could not easily leave, because he was often already in debt to the contractor for his food and lodging. He was trapped in a system that took his labor at full value and paid him back at a discount, and called it a wage. That is not slavery, and I do not want to cheapen that word by misusing it, but it is a long way from a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and it was the everyday reality for the men who dug the ditch that made Chicago rich. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And through all of it, the men kept dying. And this is the part that the story of the great city almost never mentions. The living conditions in the canal camps and the rough canal towns were squalid, crowded, and filthy, with bad water and no sanitation and no medicine that could help, and disease moved through them in waves. Cholera and dysentery, the diseases of foul water and crowded misery, swept the canal population repeatedly over the years of construction, killing men who had survived the blasting and the falling rock only to die of a sickness in a shanty. When you add together the deaths from accident, from disease, and from the sheer brutal conditions of the work, the toll on the canal was appalling. Something well over 1,000 workers are reckoned to have died building the Illinois and Michigan Canal, more than 1,000 men, most of them Irish immigrants, dead of blasting and cave-ins and cholera and dysentery and exhaustion. Over the years it took to dig 96 miles of channel across Illinois, more than 1,000. And they were buried, most of them quickly and namelessly, in the ground along the canal and around the canal towns, an unmarked army of the dead lying under and beside the waterway they gave their lives to build. I want to make sure that number, the more than 1,000 dead, does not just slide past as a statistic, because behind it are 1,000 individual men and 1,000 individual deaths, each one a whole life ended. Picture the canal towns and camps in a cholera summer. Cholera is a horrifying way to die, fast and violent, a man healthy in the morning and dead by night, his body emptied by the disease, and it moved through the crowded, filthy, waterless canal settlements like a fire, because those settlements were exactly the conditions it needed. There was no understanding yet of how it spread, no treatment that worked, nothing to do but watch men die and bury them fast before the next fell sick. And the men had nowhere to flee to, no home nearby, no family to nurse them, no doctor who could help. They died among strangers far from Ireland, in a prairie shanty, and were put in the ground quickly, often without a marker, often without their names being recorded anywhere that survives. Add to the cholera, the dysentery, the other camp diseases, the deaths from the blasting and the cave-ins and the accidents, the men crushed and broken by the work, and the toll climbs well past 1,000. Every one of them was somebody. Every one of them had crossed an ocean hoping for a better life, and found instead an early death in a ditch in Illinois. And the thing they are owed, the very least thing, is not to be forgotten entirely. And yet forgotten entirely is very nearly what they are. There is no great monument to them. There is no wall of their names. There is a canal and a city, and somewhere in the ground along that canal, unmarked and uncounted with any precision, more than 1,000 men who died to dig it. The city that the canal created would grow up over and beyond them, and it would remember the canal, when it remembered it at all, as a triumph of enterprise, and it would forget almost completely the more than 1,000 men whose graves are the true and terrible cost of it. Somehow, against all of it, the canal was finished. After the years of abandonment, a financial rescue was arranged, with Eastern and British investors taking a controlling hand in exchange for putting up the money to complete the work, and the digging resumed, and the deep cut was at last blasted all the way through the rock of the summit. And in 1848, 12 years after it was begun, the Illinois and Michigan Canal opened. A boat could now travel from Lake Michigan, down through the locks, across the divide, and into the Illinois River, and from there to the Mississippi and the sea. The two great water systems of the continent were joined, by hand, at last. There is something worth pausing on in that rescue, and that finish, because it shows how close the whole thing came to being a total loss. For years, the half-dug canal had sat abandoned, a monument to the state's ruin, and it would have been entirely possible for it to stay that way, to become one of history's great unfinished follies, a deep cut in the rock going nowhere, the more than 1,000 dead having died for a ditch that was never completed. What saved it was a hard-headed financial arrangement in which outside investors, mostly from the East and from Britain, agreed to put up the money to finish the work in exchange for control over the canal and its revenues until they were repaid. It was not charity, and it was not idealism. It was a calculation that a finished canal would generate enough money to pay them back, and it was correct. The digging resumed, the deep cut was at last driven all the way through the summit rock. The locks were completed, and in 1848 the water was let in and the boats began to move. 12 years and more than 1,000 lives after it was begun, the thing was done. The Great Lakes and the Mississippi, the two halves of the continent's water, were joined, and the men who had died in the deep cut and the men who had been paid in worthless scrip were not, of course, repaid anything at all by the canal's eventual success. The investors got their money back with interest. The city got its future. The dead got nothing, and the survivors got, at best, the memory of the worst years of their lives. Let me give you the finished thing plainly, because for all the horror of its building, it was a real and impressive piece of work. The completed canal ran 96 miles from the Chicago River to the Illinois River at LaSalle, a channel 60 feet wide and 6 feet deep, cut and banked and lined across the whole distance. To carry boats up over the divide and down the other side, a rise and fall of some 140 feet in all, the builders constructed 17 lift locks, chambers of cut stone with gates at each end that raised and lowered the boats step by step, worked by hand. Where the canal had to cross a river, they built stone aqueducts to carry the water over the water, and along the whole length ran the towpath, because the boats, as on all these canals, had no engines. They were pulled by mules and horses walking the bank, hauling the loaded boats at a walking pace through the locks and along the levels, day and night, carrying the grain and the lumber and the passengers of a booming region. It was, in its finished form, a beautiful and functional thing, a made river climbing over the backbone of the continent. And it worked, and it paid, and it transformed everything it touched. All of that, the 96 miles and the 17 locks and the aqueducts and the deep cut through the summit rock, was made by hand, with picks and shovels and black powder and mule teams and the labor of thousands of men, over 12 hard years. The finished canal was the monument. The men who made it were the cost. And only one of those two things got remembered. And what happened next is the reason this ditch matters so much, and it happened with a speed that stunned everyone who saw it. Chicago exploded. Before the canal, Chicago had been a small, muddy frontier town, a few thousand people at the swampy bottom of Lake Michigan. The canal changed everything, almost overnight. Suddenly, the rich farmland of the whole region had a cheap water route to the eastern markets and to the world, and the grain and the goods of a vast interior began to pour toward the lake, to be gathered and shipped through Chicago. The city became the meeting point, the place where the produce of the Mississippi watershed met the shipping of the Great Lakes, the hinge on which the trade of the interior turned. It grew at a rate almost without precedent, from a frontier village into one of the largest and most important cities in America within a single generation. A center of grain and lumber, and soon, of the railroads that would multiply the advantage the canal had given it. The historians of the city say it plainly. The Illinois and Michigan Canal made Chicago. It took the accident of geography, that low, wet gap between the watersheds, and turned it into the greatest transportation hub in the country, and the city that rose there rose because the canal had made it the crossroads of a continent. Every bit of Chicago's staggering 19th century growth traces back, in part, to that hand-dug ditch, and to the Irish who dug it. It is worth being concrete about how the canal made the city, because it is a genuinely astonishing transformation. Before the canal, the farmers of the rich Illinois prairie were nearly landlocked. They could grow enormous quantities of grain, but they had no cheap way to get it to market because hauling heavy grain overland by wagon over the terrible prairie roads cost more than the grain was often worth. So they farmed for subsistence, and the land's incredible fertility went largely to waste. The canal changed that equation in a single stroke. Now, a farmer in the Illinois Valley could load his grain onto a canal boat, and it could travel by cheap water all the way to Chicago, and from Chicago by the lakes to the east and the world. Suddenly, that prairie grain was worth money, and the farmers grew it by the millions of bushels, and all of it flowed to Chicago to be gathered and graded and shipped. Chicago became the great grain market of the continent, and then the great lumber market, The wood of the northern forests coming down the lakes to Chicago to be sold and sent out onto the treeless prairie that the grain came from. The city sat at the exact hinge of that trade, taking a cut of everything that passed through, and it grew explosively, from a town of a few thousand at the canal's opening to a metropolis of hundreds of thousands within a generation. And the railroads, when they came, did not replace Chicago's advantage. They reinforced it. Because they were built to connect to the trade, the canal had already concentrated there, making Chicago the rail hub of the nation on top of being its water hub. The whole staggering rise of Chicago, the stockyards, the grain elevators, the fortunes, the architecture, the millions of people, grew from the seed the canal had planted, the simple fact that this was now the place where the traffic of a continent changed from lakeboat to riverboat and back. A ditch did that. A ditch dug by hand by the Irish, and it made one of the great cities of the world. And here is the cruel arithmetic at the center of this whole story. The canal created wealth on a scale that is almost impossible to measure. The entire future of Chicago, one of the great engines of the American economy. And almost none of that wealth ever reached the men who built it. They dug the ditch that made the city that made fortunes for generations, and they were paid in scrip that was nearly worthless, and cheated by their contractors. And more than 1,000 of them died doing it and were buried in unmarked graves. The value they created flowed past them entirely, up into the city and the investors and the generations to come, while they got the paper and the graves. It is the oldest and most bitter pattern in all of these stories. The people who create the wealth getting the least of it. But rarely is it as stark as it is here, where you can draw a straight line from the bodies of the Irish diggers to the towers of one of the richest cities on earth, and see that the men at the bottom of that line got, for making all of it possible, almost nothing at all. The canal itself did not stay king for long, because the same force that ended so many of these stories came for it too. The railroads arrived within a few years of the canal's opening, and a railroad reached Chicago and beyond in the early 1850s, and the faster, more flexible trains gradually took the traffic the canal had carried. But it did not die quickly, and its long working life was a world of its own. For decades, the canal boats plied that 96 miles, hauling grain and stone and lumber and coal, and a whole community lived and worked on and along the water. The boat crews and the lock keepers and the mule drivers, many of them the children and grandchildren of the men who had dug it. There were the towns strung along the line, small and busy, living off the canal trade. There was the slow, particular rhythm of canal life, the boats gliding at a walking pace behind their mules, the locks filling and emptying, the seasons of open water and winter ice. It was a slower and older way of moving the world, surviving in the shadow of the railroads for 2 full generations, until at last the trade dwindled and a modern waterway replaced it entirely. That vanished canal world, too, is part of what the quiet corridor holds today. The canal kept working, kept hauling freight for decades, reaching its peak shipping years later in the century, but it was slowly eclipsed, and eventually, in the 20th century, it was replaced entirely by a larger modern waterway and ceased operation. Today, much of its length survives as a long green corridor, a state trail, and a string of historic canal towns, Lockport and Lamont and Joliet and Ottawa and the rest. Quiet places now, where you can walk the old towpath beside the remains of the channel the Irish cut, and where, if you know the history, you can feel the presence of the men who are not remembered anywhere else. That corridor, the whole 100-mile line of the old canal, has been preserved now as a national heritage area and a state trail, and it is a strange and moving thing to travel. The great channel that once carried the grain of a continent lies quiet, in places still watered, in places gone to marsh, running past the old canal towns with their limestone locks and their 19th century main streets, through a landscape that has moved on and mostly forgotten what happened here. You can stand at one of the old locks, the cut stone still fitted tight after nearly 2 centuries, and look at the channel and try to imagine the traffic that once passed, the loaded boats, the mule teams on the towpath, the whole roaring commerce of the young interior flowing through this ditch. And you can try to imagine the years of digging that made it, the Irish in the deep cut, the black powder and the drills, the shanty towns, the cholera summers, the scrip. It is all very quiet now. The towns are small. The canal is a park, and almost nothing along its length tells you the human truth of it. That 1,000 and more men lie in unmarked ground nearby, that they were cheated and worked to death and forgotten, that this pretty green trail is, in the most literal sense, a mass grave and a monument to injustice, as much as it is a monument to enterprise. I find that I cannot walk it without feeling both of those things, the achievement and the crime, the joined continent and the buried men, braided together in the same quiet water. And the canal's work, in a sense, never stopped, only changed hands. When the little canal grew too small for the traffic, Chicago built a far larger successor at the end of the 19th century, the Great Sanitary and Ship Canal, along much the same line, and in doing so, it did something the original diggers would have found astonishing. To carry away the city's sewage and disease, the engineers reversed the flow of the Chicago River itself, forcing the water that had always run into Lake Michigan to run instead backward, up over the divide, and down toward the Mississippi, permanently linking the two watersheds on a scale the original canal only hinted at. So the connection the Irish first cut by hand became one of the foundations of the modern city's very existence, its water supply and its sanitation and its shipping all resting, ultimately, on that first decision to join the lake to the river across the low ground at Chicago. The men who dug the first ditch with picks and black powder set in motion something that reshaped the geography of a continent and is still running today. They could not have known that. They were just trying to survive the deep cut and get paid. But the thing they started has never stopped. When I walk that corridor, I think about the strange, brutal exchange at the heart of it. Those men joined two halves of a continent by hand. They created, with their picks and their black powder and their bodies, the conditions for one of the great cities of the modern world to rise, a city that would generate wealth beyond anything they could have imagined. And their reward was worthless paper, a cheated wage, and, for more than 1,000 of them, an unmarked grave in the prairie mud. Chicago stands, glittering, on a foundation that includes, quite literally, the bones of the Irish who dug its canal. The city remembers its merchants and its builders and its architects. It does not, for the most part, remember the men in the deep cut, blasting rock from sunrise to sunset for scrip they could not spend, dying of cholera in the shanties, joining the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, so that everyone who came after them could grow rich on the connection. I have come to think that this is, in a strange way, one of the most honest of all the stories on this channel, because it hides nothing behind the achievement. Some of these histories let you feel mostly wonder. This one will not quite let you. The wonder is real, the joining of a continent by hand, the making of a great city, the sheer scale of what human muscle accomplished. But the cost is right there beside it, undisguised, in the scrip and the graves. And you cannot honestly celebrate the one without reckoning with the other. And I do not think the answer is to stop admiring what was built. The canal was a genuine wonder, and Chicago is a genuine wonder, and the men who dug the ditch would, I think, want their work to be seen and valued. What I think the honest response is, instead, is to widen the frame, to let the admiration and the grief sit in the same picture, to look at the great city on the lake and see, at the same time, the towers and the trade and the millions of lives it has held, and the more than 1,000 Irishmen in unmarked graves in the prairie who made all of it possible and got none of it. That is the whole truth, and the whole truth is better than the comfortable half of it. I think the least we can do, those of us who inherited the country their canal helped build, is to know that they were there, and to know what it cost them. And to remember, when we look at the great city on the lake, that a ditch made it, and that the men who dug that ditch by hand paid for all of it, and were paid themselves in almost nothing. So the next time you see Chicago, in a photograph or a film or from an airplane coming in low over the lake, that skyline of steel and glass rising out of the flat prairie, hold this in your mind for a moment. None of it was inevitable. It is there because of a low, wet gap in the ground and a decision to cut a ditch across it, and that ditch was cut by hand, in a deep rock, by Irish immigrants who were cheated and worked to death and buried without names. The city is their monument, though it does not know it. Every tower on that lakefront stands, in the end, on the connection they made. When I look at Chicago now, I try to see both things at once, the glittering achievement and the buried cost, because that is the truth of it, and because those men earned, at the very least, to be seen. They joined a continent. They made a city, and they vanished into the ground beneath it, holding up, as the forgotten always do, the whole magnificent weight of what they built and were never once thanked for. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming Sense of videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.